Welcome back to another episode of How It's Serviced. A reminder to viewers, we also have other podcasts that are How It Works. This is just an extension of that. Well, today on How It's Serviced, we're going to talk about engines and some of the familiar problems that are in the field beginning of the season, the end of the season, or even during. Though this is a Honda engine, it can be pretty much with any kind of engine, Briggs & Stratton, it can be a Vanguard, whatever engine you may have. This would pretty much apply some of the symptoms and issues that happen with these engines. First of all, with these engines, one of the biggest problems we find in many years of service on these is there's fuel gets into the oil because these trucks that you use multiple stops 10-15 times a day, stop and go. What happens is the fuel valve is left open in between. So you have to shut off the fuel valve at the end of every job each day. Now, to show you an example here, this is a carburetor that is on any given engine. Now what happens is, if you remove the bottom pan, as you go over bumps going down the road, this goes up and down because it's sitting in fuel, goes up and down, and every time it does this, it'll allow a little bit of fuel to be dispersed in your oil. And depending on the size of your engine and carburetor, it may be just a little bit at a time, and it may accumulate over weeks to months. So that's why it's important to shut that off, so when this bounces up and down going over your bumps on the road, that it'll limit the fuel. Now, what happens by not shutting off your fuel, like I said, the fuel will go into the oil. The oil will become very rich, and when you start the engine, it may backfire. I've even seen it where flames come out of the muffler. You can smell it when it's burning, very, very rich is the way to, so those are the symptoms. But when you change your oil, it's very watery and it smells like fuel. So what happens is, this happens to be an electric one that you can turn, and there'll be a point where there's so much fuel in your oil that you will not be able to turn the engine over, almost like being flooded. So what happens, a couple things, is the engine, what they call it, it's like hydrolock. There's a fumes in the gas that comes between the piston head and the block of the engine, and it creates a vapor barrier, very powerful to the point it won't turn over, and if you pull, it's extremely hard. So what I call is burping. So what you do is you need to take the spark plug out of the unit, and when you do, you're going to feel or hear a release and a very light gas coming out, or fumes coming out of the engine block. So that tells you that there's fuel there. Then what you need to do is change your oil and dump that and put new oil in. One of the other issues with that, you end up creating a lot of carb on the end of your plug. This is one that is very carbed up, and this is one that's brand new, so you can tell the difference. This does create an issue with that. So servicing your oil, maintaining the shutoff is one of the major issues why your engine will not run. Another part of the industry, I find that your jobs are 10-15 times a day on average, stops, and each stop the engine runs for 10-15 minutes. Now with that, the engine doesn't get hot enough, and it's these short bursts, it doesn't run high enough RPMs or long enough. So what it does, it builds up carbonation inside, carb inside the engine, which is the black powderness that you see on the spark plug. And it gets so carbed up that it won't spark. So two things can happen, is that you need to run your engine a little bit longer at the end of the day, for even 30 minutes at high RPM, so we can get hot enough to burn the carb off the plug, which would help tremendously. I would highly recommend, using an alternative fuel, a high octane fuel, such as 93, I believe is the highest. Using that would definitely help that carb buildup inside your engine. And the reason that's happening in part is because of the ethanol and the fuels. The low octane has higher water possibly higher water content, and the higher octane fuels has a tendency of getting a little hotter and burns more efficiently. Again, I think you want to look at the manufacturer's recommendations for your particular engine, but we highly recommend either a high octane, an alternative fuel like Aspen or True Fuel will definitely help the buildup of carbonation on your plug and the performance of your engine. Very, very important to maintain that fuel. Some of the alternative fuels you can leave in for long periods of time. You don't have to worry about removing the fuel even in storage. So there's definitely a benefit. The price point is a little bit higher, but overall the maintenance is less. One of the other issues in trying to start your engine, if you have a fuel pump and you have a remote fuel, this engine here doesn't have a fuel tank, but it has a remote fuel tank on some of the equipment we build. Is some of them have what is a fuel pump, and this is what a fuel pump looks like. This part on the end is a filter, and the fuel will go from the tank through your filter, through the filter, through the pump, and to your engine. Now this pump is a marine pump. It's a very high quality. Most of them are. And when you turn the key, and some of them, depending on how you have it set up, when you go to turn the key, the fuel pump will come on. You hear a clicking noise. That's a clear sound, a sign that the pump is working correctly. If you turn the key and you don't hear that clicking anymore and there's total silence, that means that it's clogged. And some people misinterpret that as defective, throw it away. That's not the case. These are very durable. They last a long, long time. So what I would do is take it apart, and there's a diaphragm in here with a tiny little hole, and on the other side is I would take a very light spray of compressed air or even a compressor, very low pressure, and blow out whatever small particles, which is usually in gasoline that you put in, and the particles are so small that it will clog your pump. Now the filter should catch that, but what happens is the particles are sometimes so small that it doesn't. So there's also an arrow on these here for flow, so you know which way it would come from the fuel pump to the engine if you were ever to replace these. Just a little FYI. The other is that your fuel filter would be clogged. A typical filter like this can be almost, I'm guessing, between 500 and 800 gallons. I would always recommend changing this every season, but depending on how much you use it, it will depend on this filter. Now on the other end of the engine, there's usually a filter right around here to the pump, which is a secondary filter that goes before it goes into the engine, so it doesn't clog the carburetor, which could also be a factor. So my recommendations is each year is either replacing the filter, blowing out your pump as much as possible. Now, another reason why your engines may not work or start or just suddenly stopped is that some of the engines, in this case with the Honda, they have a fuse that most people don't know about. If you were to take this off, in the very back, there's a fuse in the back of this unit. That basically will allow 12 volts from your battery to go to through the keyway to your starter. Sometimes people don't know that's there. Yes, there is a surge protector here, but sometimes this fuse gets blown. So for whatever reason, everything else seems to work and it was working fine. I would check that fuse in the back of the unit. Again, just a brief overview. I think it's very important to run this at high RPMs, at least 30 minutes at the end of each day to help get it hot enough to burn the carb off of these plugs. And don't forget to shut off this gas valve on your tank each and every time, each and every day. It will definitely help prevention and the longevity of your engine. My name is Ken Baker, and thank you for joining us for How It's Serviced.